Hello, everybody. Good evening. Just give me a sign that you can hear me. Still working out how to play sound and get my voice through the computer. So as I promised last week, welcome if you were here with me last week, and welcome if you weren't here with me last week. I will be doing a little bit of recapping. And I need to begin with an apology. And the apology is that due to circumstances a little bit out of my hands, I've not been able to circulate the materials for today in advance. If you look in the chat line, and I'm going to suggest that you keep the chat line open, you will see a PDF there in the chat line, and I will offer to you to print that out for yourselves. And if necessary, we can take a little break before doing that. If that won't work, then we will stay in plenary session looking at the texts all the way through. The PDF should be right at the top of the chat line, but if you just give me a second, I am going to pop it into the chat line again. So it's just downloading now. And again, many apologies. The IKAR Shabbaton meant that I simply could not get my stuff together. So we will check in a little bit further down the session and just see who's got texts and how we're gonna manage the session. But one way or another, we will learn today. If you're new to the class and weren't here last week, please just pop in the chat for me what your acquaintanceship, if any, has been with Rabbi Nachman of Bratzlav so far. Have you ever come across him? Have you ever learned any teaching of his? Have you been with people who've learned teachings of his? Have you heard that melody before? How are you and Reb Nachman of Bratzlav acquainted? Because it would be very helpful for me to know that as we move forward in the class. I did a biographical introduction to Reb Nachman last week, so I will telescope that this week and simply say that he lived not very long. He was born on April the 14th, 1772. He died on October the 16th, 1810. That made him 38 years old when he died. And with the exception of a trip to Israel, he lived in Eastern Europe. He had a very distinguished heritage from the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, on one side of his family, and all the way back to the Maharal of Prague, who is credited with making the Golem of Prague, if you know that story, on the other side of his lineage. So he was a bit of a Mozart, we can think of him as, and also very distinct from the somewhat noisy spiritual environment in which he was brought up. Already as a child, he was thinking some very profound thoughts, and he married at age 13. Had a number of children, ultimately lost his wife Zosha to tuberculosis, which was the disease that a few years later was going to claim his life too. And he is known for facing inwards to the life of the spirit. He came very early to a relationship with the divine. He sought to lift up holiness and increase holiness. He was both a storyteller and a teacher. In the fourth class of this series, we're going to look at one of his tales. He was a spiritual innovator and an iconoclast. So in a world where early Hasidut was gathered around its respective leaders, its respective tzaddikim, the righteous leaders, the holy people, he was of the belief that each and every one of us has a tzaddik inside ourselves, that it's our sacred task to cultivate over the course of our lives. He was prone, and this is going to be important for tonight's learning, he was an extremely sensitive man. He was, maybe it's possible that one of the ways to describe him psychologically these days would be as a functioning empath. And there are many psychologists who have looked at his life and his work and have attempted some kind of psychological diagnosis. I imagine, since this is a group of people learning together about this individual, we might have a psychologist or two on the call, in which case I shall value your input on this particular session. We do know that he was very sensitive, that he was prone to enormous mood swings, from exaltation to the blackest depression, and that he struggled with these not only as a matter of how they affected his day-to-day life, but what they meant in terms of the life of his spirit and his connection to God. He constantly strove to connect to God. In last week's class, we learned his teachings on prayer, which really springboard from the idea that we must find ways and continue to find ways to get close, to cleave to what is divine. And that meant that when this blackness descended on him, he perceived it as a distancing from God. And that was terrifying for him. It was a kind of death of the spirit. And the other thing I think that we need to know is that in a Europe that had already seen a few movements of people who claimed to be the Messiah, who claimed to be Mashiach, and who claimed that they were there to repair the world and very often fell short, it's arguable that towards the end of Rabbi Nachman's life, he also began to conceive of himself in that way. So there is a luminosity to the teachings towards the end of his life. The sources are sparse. There are 2 books that he wrote himself and 2 collections of he had kind of a Boswell to his Johnson, if that makes sense. He had somebody who followed him around writing down the wise things that he said. That was his disciple Natan of Nemirov. And through Natan of Nemirov, we have a couple of works of Rabbi Nachman's collected intelligence. So a couple of works that he actually wrote, a couple of works that were written by Natan of Nemirov, and quite a lot of what we might think of as fan mail. That happened after he died, where it's beautiful and deeply respectful and maybe not 100% historically accurate. So it's very sparse sources, but he's had an enormous impression on Jewish spirituality, and both within the movement that he founded, the movement of the Bratzlaver Hasidim, named after the town of Bratzlav, where he lived almost until he died. He moved to a place called Uman the year that he died, and that is where he is buried, and that is where people make pilgrimages to. You may have seen some of the pictures. Enormous numbers of people make pilgrimages to Uman for Reb Nachman's yahrzeit. And but his influence has spread far further than that, not only among Bratzlav Hasidim, but also among groups of people like us gathered here tonight, because there is something about deep spiritual intelligence that transcends the circumstances of the author of that intelligence and becomes transferable to later generations of spirituality. So I offer that as my starting point. You will have noticed that I am not a Bratzlav Hasid. I am not going to be becoming a Bratzlav Hasid anytime soon. But some of this wisdom is so beautiful and so numinous that my hope is that we can, even being outside the immediate circle of disciples, that it speaks to us beyond that, and we can claim some of that for our own spiritual education and spiritual intelligence. So we're going to be working. That's pretty much it by way of introduction, because this is primarily a text and exploration and discussion class. What I've done is, rather than go at it chronologically, there are very good chronology. What do you call them? Biographies of Reb Nachman. I've chosen a small number of subject areas that I believe have continued relevance to our spiritual lives as we sit here coming in from wherever we're coming in from. So last week we looked at prayer, and this week, sadly, it never stops being relevant. I want to look at adversity. And specifically, I'm going to be inviting us to look at adversity, not so much as a set of external circumstances, but more as how we cope with when our circumstances are such that they cause us to fall into a state of internal confusion and collapse. As I said, it never stops being relevant. And these are teachings. My guess is that we might not be fully persuaded by all of his teachings tonight, but I wanted to make sure to represent what he had to say about adversity as fairly as I could, in deference to him. And so there may be some teachings in here that don't resonate, that you don't agree with, but if they are not teachings that you can carry with them, with you and add to your own spiritual repertoire, I hope and I trust that they are wise enough and deep enough for us to be able to explore them, even if we don't necessarily feel that we want to take them home with us. Because certainly from the point of view of modern psychology, some of the things that he has to say about depression are very useful indeed. But you read articles by psychologists that say, yeah, this is great and this is very helpful. And the problem with this is ... So we have to remember, before we go into this area, when he was born and where he was living, there was no such thing as Freud. There was no such thing as psychology. There was no such thing as the understanding of the individual as a collection of internal forces through that kind of Freudian, Jungian lens that one way or another we have all at this point in our lives stumbled across, whether it was labeled as that or not. So this is one man's battle with adversity, and the adversities in his life were serious. I'll add that as well as this constant sort of gravitational pull of his depression, he also had an absolutely dreadful time both going to and coming back from the land of Israel. He nearly drowned in both directions, and he carried the trauma of that experience with him. And he lived in an age where people died early from what in our day, thank God, is preventable disease. We already know that he was widowed and widowed, and he lost other members of his family as well. So just so that we hold that kind of double view of the sense of the hardships that he suffered without the breadth of resources that is available to us. So at the same time, his declarations on this are both private and public. All good so far. Just checking in. Yeah, we're good. I'm seeing nods and thumbs and an assortment of other pleasing things. Thank you. Before we go to the texts, I want to offer a more modern understanding of what depression is, because I think it will be helpful. This is from a book. I'm putting it in the chat, but I can't multitask. I'm a very bad multitasker, so thank you for bearing with me. The book is, it's not a young book by now, but it's one of the most helpful books that I have found about depression. It's called Malignant Sadness, and it's by an author called Lewis Wolpert. And I just want to read you the very opening of this book to set, as it were, the psychological scene for some of the texts that we're going to be considering. Okay, this is what he writes. This is Lewis Wolpert, not Rabbi Nachman. It was the worst experience of my life, more terrible even than watching my wife die of cancer. I am ashamed to admit that my depression felt worse than her death, but it is true. I was in a state that bears no resemblance to anything I had experienced before. It was not just feeling very low, depressed in the commonly used sense of the word. I was seriously ill. I was totally self-involved, negative, and thought about suicide most of the time. I could not think properly, let alone work, and wanted to remain curled up in bed all day. I could not ride my bicycle or go out on my own. I had panic attacks if left alone. And there were numerous physical symptoms. My whole skin would seem to be on fire, and I developed uncontrollable twitches. Every new physical sign caused extreme anxiety. Sleep was impossible without sleeping pills. Those only worked for a few hours, and when I woke up, I felt worse. The future was hopeless. I was convinced that I would never work again or recover. There was the strong fear that I would go mad. So the rest of the book is about his, Wolpert's, experience with that. But I offer that not to depress us, but to give us in a modern language that we understand a sense of the experiences that Rabbi Nachman went through in repeated cycles over the course of his life. Okay, so by way of background, which means now that we come to the texts, and we're going to share a few texts together, and then we will see how we go, which means that it's even more remarkable that he came to some of the places he did, and that he was able to function as he did, and that he was able to leave the legacy that he had. The more I learn about him and the more I teach him, the more I had this sense that for him, the world had a different specific gravity than it does for us, that everything was heavier, more intense by a factor of whatever it was. And yet he has left his teachings behind. And that makes him, doesn't it, something of a hero, as well as a wisdom, the author of wisdom and a meaning maker. So let's go to text. An illustration. This is, this is one of the many available illustrations for depression that I pulled off the internet, and there are others. And two initial texts that I've labeled text one. One of them, just drop into the chat for me if you're familiar with the first text, number one. All the world is a very narrow bridge, but the main thing to recall is to have no fear at all. You might know it to a tune. Kol haolam kulo gesher tzar me'od. Gesher tzar me'od. The chat just exploded. Gesher tzar me'od. Yeah, you know it. I can already see there's 13 things in the chat. Let me just take a look. Okay, many of you know it. Many, 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 many of you know it. Okay. The thing is, it's not what he said. Take a look at what it was that he did say, and then drop into the chat for me what the difference is. All right? What he actually said, not that it's a bad song, don't get me wrong. It's a great song. It's just not what Rabbi Nachman said. Okay? Notice what he says. Know this. A person must cross over a very, very narrow bridge. But the most important principle is not to make yourself afraid. Okay, drop them into the chat for me and keep the chat line open. Our class exists as much on chat as it does on screen. What's the difference here? Let me see. Thank you. Yes, Hannah and Joy and Ellen and Hannah again. Yes and yes and yes. Not yes, personal agency, yes, reflexive voice, yes and yes. The narrowness is what the person perceives. Yes, Aura, yes, Wendy, yes, everybody who hasn't had a chance to get into the chat yet. Notice what he's saying, because this is also an important pillar of the way that he addresses adversity, which is that even in circumstances that are the most adverse, we have a certain agency and we have a certain power. Notice the difference from the song. It's not just like, yeah, okay, life is unbelievably tough at the moment. I can't express how tough life is, but I'm not scared. That's not it. It's the choice that we have elsewhere. He says the only reason that the world exists is to give human beings free will. It's the choice that we have in circumstances of adversity. But, and this is another important thing, we can't do it all alone. Yes, good stuff going into the chat. We can't do it alone. And for him, and I want to get this out right at the very beginning of the class, he doesn't expect us to do it all on our own. It has to be us and God. And his understanding of God might not be the same as our understanding of God. So I am going to ask us to attempt to hold his understanding of God with openness and tenderness, because it might not chime with our own theology. But when you learn about what he has to say about adversity, it is important to understand these things. So to understand that within adversity we have agency, and to understand that within adversity we are not alone in our adversity, and we do it alone. Yeah, and Barbara, thank you for bringing that up. Yes, when modern psychologists read Rabbi Nachman, the great risk with Rabbi Nachman's approach, and let's just plop it out onto the table now. The great risk with his approach is that you end up in a circle of, I'm supposed to have agency, but I don't feel like I've got any agency, and that must be my fault. And therefore, and you end up in this kind of downward spiral. And that's the major critique that I have come across that is leveled against his teachings about adversity. So we're going to have to do, yes, the overemphasis on agency. I see you. Although for him, as we're going to see, for him, the agency is by definition limited because God takes up so much space. Yeah, it really isn't us on our own. There are other things that can be drawn in there. Yeah. But I feel all of this as a prequel, because I think often what he says, yes, Hannah, yes, there is enormous wisdom coming in the chat. Yeah. We have to hold him, if we're going to learn about what he has to say about adversity, it's mixed. Okay, and I'd rather have this come out now than look at what he has to say and say, but he's completely blind to something or other. I think that in this area he does have blind spots. Yeah, nobody is immaculately wise. And again, we have to hold with compassion that he's somebody who struggled with these cycles. He created a meaning structure to enable him to function in the world. And it might not be a meaning structure that we would choose. Yeah. So we invite him in, we hold him with compassion, and at the same time, we are entitled to critique. We are entitled to there's this fabulous rabbinic teaching about flawed teachers. Let me offer the analogy. Doesn't matter for these purposes who the two teachers were, safe to say that they were two of the most famous rabbis of the Talmud, and one had become an apostate and had left completely. Elisha ben Abuya, known as the other, capital T, capital O, completely excluded from the community, but Rabbi Akiva's student, Rabbi Meir, would go and learn with him. And when they asked Rabbi Meir, what are you doing learning with that dreadful man? Don't you know that he's been thrown out of the community and he's never got a chance to come back, not ever, not ever. Rabbi Meir, they said of Rabbi Meir that he ate the date and threw away the pit. He ate the date and threw away the pit. So let me offer that as well with these teachings, yeah, because they may not be entirely to our liking, and that's okay. There's still wisdom there. All right, let me look at one more thing in the chat. Yeah, Yeah, good things in the chat. Keep them coming, folks. Keep them coming. Yeah, one of the things that I do love about Zoom and Zoom chat is that it's actually a very Jewish modality, right? We have a text on the screen, we have commentaries in the margin. We have seen this before. Yeah, this is the way we roll. So keep it coming. Keep it coming. Okay. Second text, and I want this here because this is him talking. The difference between, this tells us so much about what his experience of depression was like. The difference between depression and a broken heart is that when you have a broken heart, you can be standing in a crowd of people and still turn around and say, Master of the world. You can be broken-hearted, but still not feel that devastating sense of being abandoned and alone that we gleaned from the text by Lewis Wolpert, and perhaps also from our own experience of our own encounters with depression and those who have depression in our lives. There is something about depression that creates a feeling of total isolation, total shutdown. And this made his depression more unbearable to him because it alienated him from God. And when you exist in a framework, in a structure that says that the whole purpose of being a human being is to be connected with the divine, then when a depression like this hits and breaks that connection and alienates you from the divine, it is nothing short of excruciating. I think we can so clearly hear his own experience here, that there were times where he stood in a crowd of people, and remember, he was the leader of a community, which can be a very lonely place. He stood in a crowd of people and felt that he could not turn around and pray. Yeah, devastating for him. But he's putting words on it in a way that there were, in many ways, in late 18th century Eastern Europe, there wasn't language for this kind of thing. So in a sense, he is a kind of Freud of his time. He is one of the initiators, and we can think of him as that, maybe. Let me stop the share for a moment to look at the chat. I've got one more text that I want us to do together. Yes, yes. I'm saying, I've said, and I'll say it again, good things in the chat, interesting things in the chat, and already noticing that we don't all think the same way about this, which is commendable. We are a Zoom room full of Jews. We're not going to think the same way about this. So keep it coming. And Barbara, yes, he is making a distinction between sadness and depression. I do want to give you two pieces of his vocabulary before we go into the third text, which is going to take us more deeply into the way that he felt alienated in his own depression. He uses a number of images for it. But the two that I think, yes, Wendy, absolutely. So when you're lonely, you're double lonely. It's a double whammy. He calls it Mara Shechora, black bitterness. And this goes back to the medieval medical understanding that depression and all of the states of mind, sadness, gloominess, being saturnine in medieval language, all of those were due to an imbalance of the humors of the body. So very quick, medieval, not even 101, 0.1 is more like it. But the body has 4 humors that reflect the 4 elements. It has phlegm, it has black bile, it has yellow bile, and it has blood. And each of these is associated with a mood and a state. This is where we get the word sanguine that we still use, by the way, for somebody who's sort of settled and fairly, fairly at peace with their life. Sanguine, coming from sangue, from blood. Yes. So phlegmatic. Yes, somebody who plods on. All of those words in our vocabulary go back to the humors. And for Rabbi Nachman as well, his understanding, just like it was Maimonides and Nachmanides' understanding, was that depression came from an excess of black bile, which was the stuff that you really, really didn't want to have an excess of. And so he called it mara shechora, black bitterness, the black coming from the understanding from the humors, and the bitterness because bile is bitter. We all know this. It tastes bitter. That taste in your mouth before you hurl bile. Okay, feeling bilious, exactly. So one piece of terminology he uses for depression is marashchora. Yeah. And the other one that he uses is that he calls it the Baal Davar. And it's hard to grasp exactly what he means. Baal is Hebrew for being the master of something. Baal Habayit is the master of the house. Yeah, but Baal is also having a particular quality. Yeah, he's Baal. If you heard Rabbi Penitz's sermon from last week, oh my good Lord, yes, you must listen to that. It's a devastatingly beautiful sermon, and the priest that we spoke about in last week's Torah portion is Baal Mum. He's somebody who's got a defect. So Baal also has this sense of God. Yeah, Baal Shem Tov, to be a Baal Shem is to be talented with the name, meaning be talented with permutating the name of God for the purposes of healing. And Tov means that you were very good at it and did it very well. Ladies and gentlemen, meet the Baal Shem Tov. Master of the good name, as it's always translated, excellent practitioner of the skill of naming, is a little bit closer to what Baal Shem Tov meant in his milieu. And if you want to know more about that, you can go and Google the Baal Shem Tov and what it means to be a Baal Shem after the lesson. But you get the idea. So Reb Nachman, now back with Reb Nachman, not his great grandfather, he called his depression Baal Davar, thingness, maybe, or Mr. Thing. Yeah, the thing that gets everywhere, the thing that pushes out all other things. You know, almost, although it sounds like science fiction for us, doesn't it, because of those black and white movies, almost the thing, capital T, capital T. If that doesn't make us think too much about science fiction, but this consuming something. Yeah, Mr. Thing or Mr. Something, very, very hard to translate Baal Davar. But what both of those have in common is the quality of being consuming, as Louis Walpert said. Good. Ready for another text? Yes, yes, Joy, yes. It takes up all the available space. Yes. Ready for another text? Let's do it. Okay. So this is a rationale for why it's happening. Remember, you have here somebody who's trying to put together for themselves a way of explaining why this is happening to their world. I wonder if there's somebody who would read. Do we have somebody who's up for reading? Just go ahead, unmute, and have at it. We trust you.
Each time a person emerges from one level in order to rise to the next, the unholy forces attack him again in the form of desires and fantasies, strange thoughts, mental confusion, distractions, and all kinds of other obstacles. They stand in array against him, refusing to let him enter the gates of holiness. Many sincere people become highly discouraged when they find themselves suddenly confronted by all these desires and obstacles. They start to think that they must have fallen from their previous level because for some time they have not experienced them with the same intensity since they were dormant. When this happens, you must understand that what you are experiencing is not a fall. The time has come for you to advance from one level to the next. This is why these same old desires and obstacles have reared their heads again. Whenever this happens, it takes great strength and courage not to lose hope, but to overcome all the desires and obstacles again.
Ellen, beautifully read. Thank you so much. And it's very good to hear your voice. Okay. Comments on this text in the chat, please, because I would like us to share our wisdom on it. A couple of observations that I would like to invite. One is that you can see the cyclical quality of this, yeah, that we rise and we fall and we rise and we fall and we rise and we fall. And that has its roots in a cluster of earlier Hasidic ideas that continue on throughout Hasidut, which is the idea that to be human is to fluctuate. Okay, only for many of these thinkers, the divine is constant, which may or may not chime with our own theology. But for many of these thinkers, the divine is constant, but human beings are constantly in a state of fluctuation. And sometimes it's described as rising and falling and rising and falling. And sometimes it's described as running to and fro. You'll see it in one of the later texts, running to and fro. So you can see here that he's dealing with a shape with which we might well be familiar if we've ever started a project of actually anything. Yeah, if we've started running in the mornings, if we've started to journal, if we've made a New Year's resolution, whether at the end of Yom Kippur or for the secular New Year or both, we fluctuate away from constant practice. And we fluctuate away also in his teaching, we fluctuate in our relationship with the divine. And sometimes the divine feels very close by and we feel very integrated and very aligned. And sometimes we don't. And then our minds start to play tricks. Look at the first paragraph, yeah? Desires, fantasies, strange thoughts, mental confusion, distractions, and all kinds of other obstacles. We could almost be reading something that had its origins in Eastern spirituality. This could, you find very similar teachings in Buddhism, you find very similar teachings in the Yoga Sutras, yeah, that we fluctuate. It's our nature to fluctuate. And notice what he says. This is the agency thing. The agency that we have is to say to ourselves, this won't, it's two levels of thing really, and we might like neither or one more than the other or both. It depends. Yeah. Proposition 1 is that this doesn't mean we're going backwards. Proposition 1 is that this stage of feeling that kind of confusion and loss is a sign that we are going forward. It's a sign of progress and not a sign of regress. Yeah. And I always do this. I have two things in my head. They cancel each other out, and I can only remember one of them. Notice that implied in this is compassion for ourselves. That it's not meaningless, that the adversity is not meaningless, that the adversity means something. I'm only going to push it to there. There are people, you know, because we're knocking on the edge of, I think, those disturbing sort of theologies that manifest, Rabbi Brous writes about it in her book somewhere, I think, that manifest as, well, God only gives you what you can handle, which always makes me want to slap people quite hard. You can see how this could lead us on a path to that. But in his justification, I don't think that he wants to take us all the way to there. I think this is an invitation to try to understand and compassionately to reframe what is happening to us. And in that sense, there is wisdom. And I think also the other thing that sticks out here is that, yes, it takes strength to master it, but it also takes courage. And courage is not the same as strength. Yeah, because you can blame yourself for I'm not strong enough and I'm falling back and I'm falling back. But courage comes, we're having a very linguistic class. Courage comes from the French word cœur. It means, it comes from the heart. So he talks often about taking heart, or it gets translated as taking heart. Okay, let me stop for comments, and then I want to see if there is a way that we can do breakout rooms, and if we can't, then I'll work the class another way. Don't worry about it. Yeah. So let's see. Yes. So some people have, Agnes is asking, what do we make of this idea of levels? Agnes, drop something in the chat to tell me a little bit more about where you're coming from on that. If we're talking about hierarchy, if we're talking about one level is higher than another, I have a feeling that probably is how he thought about it. It doesn't sit very well with our modern everything, you know, everything is ultimately, it's a different mindset. Yes, Hannah, thank you. Diane, yes, running and returning. It implies a spiral more than cyclical nature of our growth. Yes, that to grow spiritually means that sometimes it feels like you're going backwards rather than going forwards, yeah, because you're working on the next iteration of the spiral. Thank you. Leah, yes, that there is a pushing back on our progress. The Yetzer Hara, yeah, pushing back on our progress is proof that we're moving forward. Yeah. And the further forward we move, the more our old stuff wants to reach out and drag us back. You get the idea. Yeah. We'll have come across this in other contexts as well. That the more you grow, the more you're tracking behind you. Diane, yes. Wondering, Bill, it's a great question. The unholy forces, were they conceived of as internal or external? I think I will say that for Reb Nachman, it was a bit of both, but more and more you see him saying that depression is evil. And this is another place where every psychologist on the call is going to slap their heads. Yeah. But he does sometimes say that depression is a manifestation of the so-called other side, and therefore we must fight it. And for him, I'm sure that's what it felt like. I'm sure for him, that's what it was. Ellen, yes. Wendy, yes. Going into the new is always frightening. Yes. Leah, that undertow that is the Yetzer Hara, the part of us that pulls us backwards rather than forwards, wants us to be entrenched. Yeah. Kayla, yes. I agree. Yeah, I think that every human being goes, if you look at the idea that every human being goes through these fluctuations, and to go through these fluctuations to gain God and lose God and gain faith and lose faith, that's all part of the process of being human, then it takes us to an interesting place indeed when we look at what we like to classify as mental illness. Yeah, maybe it's a bit of a sliding scale of being human, actually. Yeah, not that I have to be careful here, not that I'm not saying there isn't such a thing as mental illness, because God knows there is. Yeah, but the idea that you have people who are mentally well over here and people who are mentally ill over here, and they don't have a whole lot that is similar with each other. I think you're right, Kayla. I think you could definitely take a poke at that. I think you could. And I think he's one of the people who helps us with that. Yeah, spiritual and psychological. Wendy, thank you for giving me the opportunity to drop a small Hebrew bomb. People on the call know, I think, that Hebrew has more than one word for the soul. Yeah, there's nefesh, there's ruach, there's neshama, and in the Kabbalistic system there are two more. There's one called chaya and one called yechida. So we have multiple words for the soul, and all of those translate into English as soul. But the earliest name for psychology in modern Hebrew was nafshiyut, from nefesh. So the spiritual and the psychological are not only connected, they're the same word in Hebrew, or they started out as the same word before modern Hebrew went to psychologia, which my teacher of blessed memory, whose yahrzeit is coming up soon, used to be horribly scornful about. Yeah, the old stuff can be comfortable, yes. And courage does require, and we'll get there in the next set of texts, Wendy, where does faith play into all of this? Can we put ourselves in a place where we can say, okay, today feels like this, and it really, really does, but can I find it in myself to believe that this can change? Yeah. And we can be courageous and terrified at the same time. Agnes, is he saying that it's a constant? Agnes, I'm going to ask you to wait till next week's class, because next week's class we have a fantastic text about what we can call the integration of the bad. Can I ask for your patience until next week? Okay, and we'll deal with it then. Next week's class, by the way, is going to be about joy. I feel that, you know, having gone this deep with this stuff, the least I can do is give you a class on joy. And he has plenty to say about that as well. Does he see the progression as the ascent in Kabbalah? And yes, that's a yes and no. Hasidic understanding of Kabbalah is not quite the same as the classic understanding of the Sephirot. So he kind of does and he doesn't. And he also takes this material off in a direction of his own. Diane, yes. Yeah, Jonathan, you're right. Some people do say that God is bowling bad stuff at us to bring us back to God. Yes, people do say that. For myself, I can say I find it difficult to believe in that kind of God. I find it difficult to believe in a God who carpet bombs me so that I'll become a better person. And in myself, I have to say my tendency is to shrink in that situation and not seek. But it's definitely a belief system that is around, and it borders. It's another one of these things that borders onto a belief system. Kayla has just asked, is there class next week? There will be class next week because it's OIS Memorial Day by the time we get to class, right? Memorial Day will have been and almost gone. And it's a good day for a class on joy. So there will be class next week. Okay. It is 8:01, and with your indulgence, I want to ask how many people have been able to get hold of the text packet? Just show me with a Zoom hands up, if you would. Yeah, so some of you have definitely got it. Okay. See what we've got. Okay, 5 others, 6 others, Elisa. Yeah, I'm going to pop it in the chat one more time. I want to see if I can work things so that there are people in every breakout room who have got text. Okay, this is highly complicated for me and might be beyond my abilities, but I am going to do my best. And let me pop the text in the text packet in the margin just one more time. Oops. Not to you, but to all of you. All right. Another thing that I can do if you've been unable to get hold of the text package is to message me personally, and I'll see if I can send it to you personally in the Zoom chat. But let me, and again, I seek forgiveness for this one. I will not do it this way next week. Okay, so there's one more text packet coming through in the chat line. I'm going to try breaking us into breakout rooms of maybe 4 people. Let me introduce by saying that there are a lot of texts. There are another 5 texts. I would suggest everybody please start with text number 5, which is an absolutely classic text, and then pick 1 or maybe 2 more. Okay, but please start with text number 5. Because if nothing else from this lesson, you need to have that. Okay, here we go. Let's give it a go and hope that it works. And if you haven't got somebody with a text packet in your breakout room, let me know immediately and I will find a solution for you. Okay. And I'm going to give us a 30-minute breakout and figure that end of class will be at 8:45. It is listed as a 2-hour class, so I trust that you will indulge me, and I'll understand if you can't stay. Ready? Off we go. Okay. I think that there's been some attrition. I did hear from a few people before we went into breakout rooms that they weren't going to be able to stay. So that is to be expected. And I think what I'd like to ask, you know, we're on a single screen at this point, which I think means, oh, my camera's off. Thank you. So it is. Here I am. Oh, oh, joy. Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness gracious me. Lovely. There's some beautiful hellos happening and some beautiful thanks happening in the line. I think we're a small enough room at this point to be able to put hands up and talk about what we gleaned from this. So I am interested to know if out of the teachings that you studied, you found in there a nugget. First of all, let's go with, did you find in there a nugget that made sense to you? Did anything sort of resonate strongly for you? And if so, what was it? Just go ahead and put up your Zoom hand, or you know what, just unmute, and the person who shouts loudest will be the person who speaks, because that's how Zoom sorts out. It's very like real life, really, isn't it? Something that you gleaned from his wisdom, something that he taught you that you didn't know before. Gail, thank you. Yes. To know that there is good and to seek the good. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was the text that I asked everybody to begin with, the text from the section that it comes from, and you might come across it. It's a commentary, it's his commentary on a line from Psalm 146. Asher al Adonai b'chayai, I shall sing to God in my life. Azamer el Elohai be'odi, I shall chant to God be'odi. One of the things that he does brilliantly is he learned it, I think, from his great-grandfather, is that he looks at a piece of Hebrew text that is figurative. Azamra Lelohai Bodi tends to get translated as I will sing hymns to God while I still continue to exist. Be'odi. Yeah. And he looks at that and he says, no, that's not what that means at all. What that means is I shall sing to God with the tiny, tiny, tiny little bit that is left of me. Yeah, my little odd, my little, you know, like with the very, very last tiny bit of me. And that's what springboards into this idea of digging down for the, digging deep for the good. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a powerful teaching. Other things, Elisa. Yeah, I see you.
I think my whole group was really struck by the incredible supportive lack of perfectionism. That even if you find something, you find some little mitzvah you did or whatever, even if you did it, you were right for the wrong reasons, that's good enough. You have to keep looking for such things. You need to apply your own agency to find it, but that's good enough. And it's very parallel to what we studied last week in terms of prayer, that, you know, if you get 1 little minute a day, that's good enough. If you're just like pretending to read so people leave you alone, that's good enough. If you focus on one word in a prayer, that's good enough.
Yeah.
And this is just extremely supportive and encouraging. So we were all struck by that.
Thank you. Thank you. It is. I mean, this is the and I think the more so it's poignant, right? Because of the heavy lift that he was performing psychologically. But yeah, it's a kind doctrine. Yeah, one of the things that can happen with depression is that, as Barbara was saying, we end up passing terrible judgment on ourselves, and then that makes it worse. But this, if anything, is the reverse, and the reframing and the calling of our attention towards the positive and toward the way that we can connect. I want to ride on top of it a teaching that I didn't bring today, but I first learned from the woman who taught me how to chant Torah. Her name is Honey Smith, and she's a great lover of Rabbi Nachman. And she says that elsewhere he puts forth a similar teaching to that, the idea about the good point, the tiny little good point, yeah, the Nukudat Tova that is inside you. And he teaches that to be a true leader of prayer is to be able to gather together. You sort of look around the room and you gather together all of the nukudot tovot, all of those little tiny points from all the people in the room, and then you string them into melodies. You use those points to make melodies. So it's like fireflies dancing. Right? That's what it means to be a true shaliach tzibur. It's not how well you know the prayers or how good your tunes are or how many albums you've made. It's, can you do that? Can you draw out and amplify the good points in the room? And that's a teaching I've always loved, so I wanted to share it. Wendy, I see you.
The other thing, one of the many things that we touched upon in the group, that we talked about the notion that Rabbi Nachman connected with God. And also this teaching reminds us that these good points that we search for within us is a reminder of the divine spark that each one of us has inside. That, and when you think of it that way, also it helps give some impetus to your search. Oh, there is, because I think we are our fiercest critic, each one of us. Each one of us, because we know our own shit better than anybody.
Yeah, it's true.
You know,
it's true. Agree. Definitely true. Thank you, Wendy. Someone else, any other little pearls, little points? Bill, I saw you had a hand up a little bit ago. Would you do you
I was just going to say, near the end, I really started to think less about whether what these texts were saying were objectively true, and more that they were very psychologically astute. I.e., they're ways to get yourself out of the blackest of places, and whether God really sends you troubles to improve yourself is not necessarily as important as in thinking of things that way is a very good way to deal with incredibly difficult circumstances.
Thank you. It's reframing, right? It's the expanding of perspective, the altering of perspective, and that we do always have the choice to do, I think. Yeah, even when it's incredibly, incredibly, incredibly hard. Yeah, not to give in to despair, which is something that I'm going to come back to. I see Mike and I see Karen. Yeah. Mike, where did you go? Oh, we can't hear you, my friend.
No, you can.
Yes,
There we go. Yeah, we went on also to text 6. And in the second paragraph was something that the whole thing kind of disturbed many of us. But the second paragraph stood out in a way that I don't think even you intended. But it was a quote from King David. And there are, in mysticism, as you know, there are different pockets, and with different understandings. And I was trained in a King David mysticism pocket. And when I saw that, it made me see Rabbi Nachman in a whole other way, because I am trained and familiar with that particular pocket. It's not the best term for it, pocket, but so thank you, because I'm going to study him more, because now I just see him differently, because we may actually come from a understanding that we have in common that is unique in Judaism. So I have been. I did get the book, The Seven Beggars. So when you see me reading on Saturday morning, you don't have to ask me what book I'm reading again. It's this one. But if you have, I did go down through also a list of biographies, because I want kind of read about him. So you don't have to tell me here on the screen, but maybe at some point you can steer me to one of the many. So I'm reading one that you recommend.
Great. I will do a little book list at the end of the course, maybe. Yes, a sort of for further reading type of thing. Karen. Thank you, Mike.
We talked a little bit about retirement and how these texts apply to retirement and our spiritual practices, and then we looked at text 7 also, and really got into a very nice conversation about starting things and having momentum when you start things, and how to keep the momentum, and about renewing our fire and passion for God. So that was also very interesting. And yeah, so we had a great discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad. Yeah, what I've popped text 7 up on the screen for those who didn't get to it, not a problem. And what I've tried to do, texts 1 and 2 and 3 were collective texts, but what I've tried is to give a sense of the toolbox that he provides. And as people have observed, there is this, there's the idea of reframing, but there's also that idea that in this text, in text 7, he lives right next door in my head to that wonderful text from Ralph Waldo Emerson, which says something along the lines of finish the day and be done with it, and make a fresh start again tomorrow. Now, Emerson hasn't been born, I think, yet at this point, but the idea of renewed opportunity, the idea that we don't have to be dragging yesterday into today, that's also a very powerful spirit. It's elsewhere in Hasidism as well, but it's a powerful, powerful idea. Good. So my hope is that, oh my goodness, look at the time. I'm so sorry. But this is all good stuff. My hope is that if there is a text or texts that you didn't get to, you'll be able to make friends with those other texts based on the conversations that we've had in class this evening, and thus your learning will continue. Anybody else, any other comments? So I want to finish with a little bit that is it's a retelling of what happened on Shabbat Nachamu, which is the second, it's the first Shabbat after Tisha B'Av, Shabbat Nachamu, and it's called Shabbat Nachamu because we read the Haftarah that begins Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, comfort, comfort my people. And it's the first Shabbat in the series of 7 that leads up to Rosh Hashanah. So we know, because we have the benefit of hindsight, that when he's speaking on Shabbat Nachamu in 1810, he is not going to make it through to the end of Sukkot. The tuberculosis has already taken hold, and it is going to get him. But this is what Natan of Nemirov recalls of that Shabbat. He says that they're sitting around a table because that's what Hasidim do. Yeah, they pray the service in the synagogue or in a room or wherever it is that they're praying the service, and then they come back and they all eat together, and then the rabbi teaches. You may have come across the terminology. It's called a tish, which is the word for table, because everyone is sitting around the rabbi's table. So after the teaching, he became very joyous and told the people to begin singing Azamer Bishvachin, which is a table song, immediately before the washing of the hands preceding the meal. He had been so weak of late that they had hardly sung at all, but now he was so elated that he ordered them to sing. He himself sang along with them. Afterwards, he spoke with us very happily and with an awesome and wondrous grace. He sat through the meal with great joy, talking with us and strengthening us greatly. Then he shouted from the very depths of his heart, Gewalt, do not despair. He went on with these words, there is no such thing as despair at all. He drew forth these words slowly and deliberately, saying, there is no despair. He said the words with such strength and wondrous depth that he taught everyone for all generations that they should never despair, no matter what it is that they have to endure. So that's about 2 months before he dies. And you will see these, you'll see those words in Hebrew, Ein Yeush Ba'olam. You'll see these words in Hebrew on bumper stickers, you'll see them on t-shirts, you'll see them on baseball caps. They become, because it was given so close to the end of his life, a fundamental teaching. So we've explored over the course of tonight this fine balance that he had to negotiate between despair and possibility, between depression and getting close to God, between dealing with the fluctuations of his own life. And yes, he could have been. Next week, we will, post-Memorial Day, we'll have a look at what he's got to say about joy. And what I love about what he's got to say about joy is that you look at it on the page and it sounds very simple, and he uses very simple words for it, but really it isn't. I want to conclude with music. We opened with music. I want to conclude with music. I have a little bit of an agenda here because one of the people singing here is my sister, and she composed this. This is a new setting of the bridge song. the idea of the very narrow bridge. And even though she too is using the secondary version rather than the primary version, I hope that you're going to agree that she gets something of the sense of it. So I'm going to set up so that we can share video. Just bear with me for 2 more minutes, and you've been very patient. Thank you very much indeed. This was recorded at the Shalshelet Festival of New Jewish Liturgical Music. She wrote it in 2010, and it was put up on YouTube 2020. So let me just get it for you. Hold on a minute.
For about $1 a day, this new company will ship you compostable zipper bags and give you free trash bags for life.
Fearful. Okay, and I am going to share the screen so that you can see her. Let's do it. I will see everybody next week. And I promise I will send round the texts. I'm behind on that because of the Shabbaton, but I'll send last week's and this week's texts. The classes, the recordings of the classes are on YouTube, and I'll send you a link to Judith as well. I'll see you next week.
Yeah.
Have
Thank
a
you.
great Memorial Day.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye-bye, you
God
guys.
bless.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.